The twin suns of Velkur rose slowly over the blood-colored sands of the arena. As the crowd gathered in loud excitement, the air was hot and dry and buzzing with voices from 100 alien races who had traveled across light years to watch the greatest duel of the year. This was the Velkorian Duel of Honor, a deadly tradition where only the strongest survived, and this time there was a twist that made the event even more thrilling for the galaxy. For the first time in Velkorian history, a human was invited to fight in the arena, and not just any human, but a soldier from Earth, someone who had survived wars across colonies, who had fought in trenches and ruins under alien skies. His name was Captain Eli Voss, and he stood alone in a shaded corner of the arena, looking at the sand as the crowd laughed and pointed at him, their voices full of mockery and doubt. The Velkorians were tall and proud, with silver armor and long blades made of glowing plasma. They believed their weapons were the finest in the galaxy, light, sharp, and deadly. They looked at the old metal sword in Eli's hand and laughed loudly, calling it a piece of junk, a farmer's tool, a toy from a forgotten world. Zakar, the Blade King, stood at the center of the arena, his silver body shining under the twin suns. His armor was carved with the names of all his past victories, and his plasma blade hummed with energy. It was light as air and could cut through steel like paper. He was the undefeated champion of Velkur, a warrior who had never bled in battle, never tasted defeat, never known fear. And now he was facing a human with a piece of sharpened metal. Zakar raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. He pointed his blade at Eli and smiled wide. His voice echoed across the arena like thunder. This human brings a sword made of steel. Does he think this is a museum? Perhaps he thinks we are children to be scared by toys from ancient Earth. The crowd roared with laughter. Some threw bits of sand at Eli, others shouted insults and jokes in alien tongues. But Eli said nothing. He stood still like a statue, his eyes calm, his face unreadable. He did not raise his sword. He did not move. He just watched and waited, and the silence around him was different. Not fear, not weakness, but something colder, something older, like a storm gathering before it breaks. Behind the arena, in the preparation chamber, the other warriors watched from screens. They whispered among themselves. Some said the human would die in seconds, others thought he was mad. A few stared at the sword in his hand and wondered why he chose such a thing in a duel of death. Among them, a young alien named Kael'thar, who served as a student of Velkorian combat traditions, whispered softly to his teacher, "Why does he bring steel to a plasma duel?" The old master did not answer at first. He looked at Eli on the screen, then spoke in a voice that trembled slightly. "Because he knows something we do not, something lost, something forgotten, something from a world that learned to kill." Without light back in the arena, the announcer rose into the air on a floating platform and began to speak in a booming voice heard across the entire city of Velkur. "Today is the duel of honor, the challenge of strength and pride, the fight where only skill decides fate. We welcome our champion Zakar, the Blade King, undefeated master of the duel. And now we welcome the challenger from Earth, Captain Eli Voss, the warrior of steel." The crowd cheered again, though some voices were quieter. Now eyes turned toward Eli, not just with laughter, but with curiosity. Some began to notice the way he stood, the way his hand rested on the sword, not nervously, but with calm readiness, like it had rested there 1,000 times before. Zakar raised both arms and shouted, "I will end this in one strike. I will break his toy and send him crawling back to Earth." Eli still said nothing. His eyes were fixed on Zakar, and he blinked only once, then slowly turned and walked back into the waiting chamber to prepare for the duel. At sunrise, the crowd watched him leave, unsure how to feel about the human who did not speak, who did not smile, who did not fear. In the chamber, Eli placed his sword on the metal table and began to clean it with a cloth. His hands moved slowly with care, like someone polishing an old memory. The sword was made of carbon-forged steel, black with age, but sharp as lightning. It had no lights, no hum, no glow, but it felt heavy with stories, with battles long past. Outside the chamber, Velkorian news drones flew through the sky, broadcasting images of the human to millions watching across planets. The words below the screen read, "Earthling brings rust to blade match and human relic to face champion." In a quiet corner of the viewing tower, an old Velkorian historian named Valsur watched the broadcast with his many eyes and frowned. He knew what steel was. He knew what humans were before the alliances, before peace, before the stars. Were tamed, he remembered old records, old reports from the early wars. He whispered to himself, they do not know what steel is, they do not know what it means to hold something that never dies. As night fell, the arena lights glowed blue and red, and the crowd slowly returned to their homes or camps, talking about the upcoming duel. Some still laughed, others argued, some now wondered if the human had a secret weapon, but all agreed they would come back in the morning to see blood on the sand inside his chamber. Eli sat alone, his sword resting beside him. He looked up at the ceiling, at the stars through the open skylight, and remembered earth, remembered rain and wind and fire and screams, remembered the weight of a blade in his hand when everything else was gone. He whispered softly, steel remembers. No one heard him, but the sword seemed to shine just a little in the moonlight, a soft silver gleam across the black edge, like it too was waiting, like it too was alive in the far tower Zachyar trained with a holographic bot slicing through its images with blinding speed, laughing as each cut left sparks in the air. He danced with his blade, a show of power, a display of speed and control. His trainers cheered, his fans roared from the screens around him. He paused, looked at the camera, and said, tell Earth to dig a grave for their warrior. The screen cut to black. Back in the quiet of the human chamber, Eli closed his eyes and slept like a soldier before battle, calm, breathing steady, sword by his side. Like a friend above the arena, the twin moons of Velker crossed paths, and the sky turned dark red, a rare sign in Velkorian lore known as the crossing of blades, a sign of a duel that would be remembered for generations, a duel where something strange, something powerful would happen. The guards at the arena gates whispered about it, the scholars wrote it down, the priests looked to the stars and said nothing, and in the sand below, where footsteps would soon be made, the wind carved a shape without reason, without plan, a shape that looked like a blade, a human blade. The night grew silent, and the world waited for dawn, waited for steel, waited for the duel. The twin suns had not yet risen, and the arena was quiet. But deep within the preparation chambers, the sounds of training echoed through metal halls as Zachyar, the Blade King, moved like a storm in the training pit, his plasma blade flashing in the dim blue light. He struck at speed bots, which blinked in and out of form, holographic warriors designed to dodge, block, and attack faster than most living things could react. Each strike from his glowing blade left a blur in the air, and the bots exploded into sparks with every hit. The chamber vibrated slightly as his power flowed through the floor and into the very walls. Zachyar smiled with pride, watching himself in the polished black mirrors as his perfect form danced with death, each movement fast, clean, and deadly. His trainers stood nearby, taking notes and cheering as he moved. They whispered about how easily he would crush the human challenger, how Earth would finally understand that it had no place among true warriors, how Zachyar would make the duel a lesson in galactic strength. But in the chamber on the other side of the arena, there was no noise, no sparks, no machines moving, no bots fighting back, only silence and the sound of a metal blade sliding against a stone. Captain Eli Voss sat on the floor, sharpening his sword with a simple whetstone, the blade resting across his knees, long, black, and cold, with no glow, no hum, and no movement, just steel against stone and breath against silence. He moved slowly with care, as if each stroke told a story, as if the blade had to be reminded of what it once was, what it was made for. He had no trainer, no cheering crowd, no advanced gear. His chamber was empty of everything except a small table, a chair, and a rack with one piece of cloth used for cleaning the sword. Outside the chamber, a few Velkorians walked past the viewing glass and laughed, pointing at the simple tools, shaking their heads at the human sitting in silence. Some pressed their hands against the glass and made jokes, pretending to cry or fall asleep, calling him a fool from a backward planet. But Eli never looked up, he never reacted. He kept sharpening the blade with the same steady rhythm, as if he could not hear them, as if they were not there at all. And after a while, even the watchers grew quiet, unsure if they should still laugh or feel something else, something colder. In the halls above the arena, a group of young warriors stood around an elder called Varnock, the curator of duels, a historian who had seen every battle fought in the arena for the past 300 years. His body was slow, but his eyes were sharp, and his voice carried weight. When he spoke, one asked him why the human brought a blade of steel into a place where energy and plasma ruled, where light cut through everything and armor was made of particles instead of metal. Varnock did not answer at first. He looked out over the empty arena, where the sand was still untouched. Then he said in a low voice that made the Group leaned closer because steel is not just a weapon, it is a memory, it is pain forged into form. It is what humans used when the stars were still just lights in the sky, when they killed not for sport, but to survive, when they bled in mud and rain. And fire, and learned to stand against steel, is old and forgotten, yes. But it is not weak. The warriors looked at each other, unsure what to say. Some laughed nervously, others fell silent. One asked if Varnock believed the human could win. Varnock only said the sword is not the joke here. Back in the human chamber, Eli stood slowly and walked to the rack, where a leather wrap waited for the blade. He placed the sword inside and tied the wrap with care, then lifted it and held it across his back. The weight of it seemed to anchor him to the floor, as if the weapon and the man were one thing, made of the same strength. He walked to the center of the chamber and began slow movements, sword drills from earth passed down from soldier to soldier, from war to war, each step slow and sharp, each swing clean and heavy. The blade sang through the air, not with sound, but with presence, like it cut not just the space before it, but the very silence around it. The sensors in the chamber recorded every movement and sent data to the main tower, where duel masters watched and shook their heads, saying the human was slow, saying his moves were simple, saying he stood no chance against the speed and grace of plasma combat. But a few leaned forward, watching closer, and saw something in the way Eli moved, something not in the data, something beyond numbers and speed. They saw control, they saw purpose, they saw a man who had fought with this blade, not just in training, but in battle, real battle, where the enemy did not blink away when hit, where each strike meant life or death. As the night passed and the hour of the duel came closer, the lights of the city dimmed, and the people began to gather once again. The arena filled with voices and lights, but this time the tone was different, still loud, but with less laughter. More eyes watched the human gate with curiosity, more whispers asked what kind of man faces death. With silence in the private chamber of Zakiar, the champion sat, now dressed in his silver combat armor with the symbols of his victories carved into every plate. His plasma blade floated beside him, charged and ready. His trainers adjusted his armor and spoke words of glory and power, but he was staring at the screen showing Eli walking through the arena halls alone, sword across his back. No guards, no machines, no armor. He frowned just slightly and said nothing. In the control room, the duel officials met to finalize the rules again. They reviewed the ancient code of the duel of honor. They confirmed that both fighters had agreed to the terms: first to blood, no killing unless agreed upon. Weapons must be handheld, no drones, no shields, no field armor. When the final checks were done, the officials nodded and sent the message to both chambers. The duel would begin in 1 hour. Back in his chamber, Eli sat once again on the floor, sword across his knees, eyes closed, breathing steady. He did not speak, he did not move, he simply waited, like the blade itself. And then across the arena, the bells began to ring, long, slow, deep sounds that echoed into the sky and told the world that it was time, that the duel of honor was about to begin. The crowd roared, the lights turned to red, the gates of both chambers began to open slowly, and the floor of the arena began to shift, rising upward to bring the champions to the Sandzakar stepped onto the platform, first raising his blade high to cheers and chants of his name. His armor shined under the light, his face full of pride. Eli stepped onto his platform with the sword in hand, unwrapped and ready. The steel caught the light, not with glow, but with cold reflection, and he looked across the arena straight at the champion for the first time. Zakiar did not smile. The platforms stopped, and both men stepped onto the sand, facing each other across a circle drawn by age and tradition. The wind blew softly, and the sky turned gold as the twin suns rose in silence. The announcer lifted into the air and spoke the final words. This is the duel of honor, Zakiar of Velker versus Eli Voss of Earth. First to draw blood wins. Prepare. Both men raised their blades, both stood still. The crowd leaned forward and the duel began. The twin sons of Velker climbed higher in the sky, casting long golden rays across the blood-sand arena, where two warriors now stood silent, facing each other with blades in hand, and a storm of eyes upon them. The crowd filled every level of the arena, their voices quiet, their breaths held, their minds torn between fear and excitement, as the greatest duel in memory prepared to begin. Above the circle, a tall figure floated on a black platform, his robe shimmering like oil and his voice sharp as broken glass. He was the arbiter of honor, the one who held the laws of the duel in his hands, and his every word shaped the battle that would follow. He raised his long fingers to the sky, and silence fell upon Velker, not a voice, not a breath. Not a sound as all turned their eyes to the center of the arena. This is the duel of honor, he began in a voice that echoed through the stone towers. This is the oldest tradition of our world, a contest of skill, courage, and truth where words hold no weight and only blood speaks, where power must be proved not through titles or rank, but through the edge of a blade and the strength of a soul. He turned to the two warriors, his eyes glowing with judgment. Zekar, of Velker, you stand undefeated. The Blade King of the Nine Rings, the wielder of plasma flame and master of the speed arts, do you accept the laws of the duel? Zakar took one step forward and spoke in a calm and proud voice. I accept the laws, and I shall not be the first to bleed. The Arbiter turned his gaze to the human who stood silent with his steel blade resting against his shoulder, eyes half closed, face unreadable, his armor simple and dark, marked only by a few scratches and stains from old battles long past. Elivasov. Earth, the Arbiter said, soldier of 1,000 miles, walker of ruined worlds and bearer of forgotten steel, do you accept the laws of the duel? Eli gave a slow nod and said in a voice like cold stone, I accept. The Arbiter lowered his hands, and the rules were spoken. No shields, no drones, no field armor, only blade and body shall decide the outcome, only blood shall mark the end, the first to bleed shall fall, no interference, no mercy, no retreat. Begin when the flame falls. A flame of blue fire rose above the circle, then hovered for a moment in the air, every eye fixed upon it as it danced with the wind, and then slowly began to fall toward the sand below. The two warriors stood still, neither moved, neither blinked. The world seemed to freeze. The only sound, the soft whisper of wind across steel and plasma. The flame touched the sand. The duel began. Zekar moved first, his plasma blade sweeping in a wide arc, glowing with deadly energy. His speed was unmatched, a blur across the sand, a flash of silver and light. His feet barely touched the ground as he rushed forward, his eyes locked on the human who still stood motionless at the edge of the circle. I watched and waited, not with fear, not with panic, but with the cold patience of a man who had seen death before, who had held it in his hands and walked away. He did not raise his sword until the last possible moment, until the glow of the plasma was close enough to burn his skin. He moved a single step to the side, a tilt of the wrist, and the steel blade met the glowing plasma with a sound that was not a clash, but a scream, a sharp, cutting wail that echoed across the arena as sparks flew from the point of contact, and both warriors stepped back in perfect balance. The crowd gasped. For the first time, the human had blocked the plasma blade with nothing but ancient steel, and neither blade had broken, neither man had fallen. Zakar narrowed his eyes for the first time, feeling the weight of this duel not as a show, not as a celebration, but as a true fight, a test he had not expected to face. He attacked again, this time faster, sharper, with a twist of the wrist and a spin of the foot. His blade came from below, from above, from the side, dancing with deadly rhythm, designed to confuse, to overwhelm, to end the fight in seconds. But Eli met every strike with calm precision. His sword moved less, but hit harder. His steps were slower, but always in the right place. His eyes never left Zakar's chest, reading every breath, every shift of muscle, every intention before it became action. The steel and plasma clashed again and again, the sound of each strike ringing like thunder through the air, and with every blow the crowd leaned closer, with every breath they held tighter, unsure who would fall first, who would bleed, who would win. In the control room high above the arena, the duel masters watched in silence, their screens filled with data and numbers, none of it making sense. The human's movements did not match known patterns. His reaction time was too slow by calculation, yet he blocked every attack with perfect timing, and his blade showed no signs of damage, no signs of weakness. One master whispered, "How can steel do this?" Another replied, "It is not the steel, it is the man who holds it." Down below, the Arbiter watched with a face carved from stone, his eyes following each movement, each step, each moment of danger, his hands ready to raise the signal at the first drop of blood. Zakar grew faster, his attacks wild, now no longer dancing, but striking with force, raw and unmeasured. His pride bleeding, even if his skin was not. He had never fought this long in a duel, never faced a warrior who did not fear his power. He shouted with rage and charged forward. Blade raised high. Eli waited one breath, two, then stepped forward, not back, not away, but toward the attack, and brought his sword up in a rising arc. Steel met plasma again, but this time the sound was different, deeper, louder, as if the sand itself cried. Out, and both warriors stepped back. Once more a line of smoke rose from Eli's shoulder where the edge of plasma had brushed the fabric. No blood, no cut, just heat. But close, so close, the crowd screamed. The arena shook, the tension rising like a storm. Above the blood sand, as both warriors paused, breathing heavy, blades raised, eyes locked. The rules had been spoken, the terms were clear, and now the moment was near when one would fall, when the laws of the duel would be written in red, not stone. Zakar held his blade tighter, the heat of it now burning his hand, the strain of his own speed catching up with him, to the weight of his own pride becoming heavy. Eli adjusted his grip slightly and took a small step forward, not to attack, not to threaten, but to balance, to wait for the next move, the final move. And the arbiter watched with the eyes of judgment, waiting for the single drop that would end it all. The air inside the arena had changed. It no longer carried the joy of a festival or the pride of a celebration. It now pulsed with something older, something colder, the kind of tension that wraps around the heart and holds it tight, the kind of silence that makes every sound louder, every breath deeper, every blink slower, the kind that fills the chest with weight and makes the strongest warriors remember fear. The crowd sat still, eyes wide, mouths closed. Not one voice spoke as the two duelists stood in the blood sand ring, blades ready, hearts steady, faces unreadable above them. The twin suns, now high in the sky, cast long lines of golden fire across the ground, making the edges of each shadow sharp and bright like cracks in glass. Zakar held his plasma blade in both hands, its humming glow wrapping around the metal handle like a living flame. The light pulsed in rhythm with his breathing. His armor was marked with heat lines from past battles, but none from this one. Yet his steps were light, his stance ready, but his eyes now narrowed, not with confidence, but with focus. Something had changed in the last exchange, something he did not expect. Eli Voss stood across the circle, his boots digging gently into the sand, his steel blade angled downward, reflecting nothing, yet catching everything. His sword had no glow, no charge, no hum, but it vibrated with a quiet promise, a promise forged in fires older than Velker, older than this arena, older even than the name Zakar itself. Arbiter watched from above his floating platform, unmoving, his eyes like stone, his mind ready to end the match at the first sign of blood, yet uncertain now about who would fall first, uncertain about which name would echo through history and which would be forgotten in the dust. Zakar moved first, again faster than most eyes could follow, his plasma blade slicing from the left, a feint, then spinning upward toward the right shoulder, a strike designed to end fights quickly, to draw blood before defense could form. It was a move taught only to masters, and even they used it with care. Eli stepped into the strike instead of away, his sword rising with perfect timing, his body turning with the motion, not blocking, but gliding against the energy edge. The steel and plasma met again in a burst of white sparks, and this time both warriors pushed forward, both blades pressed and slid and locked for just a second. In that moment their faces were inches apart, eyes locked, not with anger, but with understanding. Zakar saw something in those human eyes, not fear, not pride, but memory, a long memory, full of battles, full of pain, full of choices that never ended with cheers. Eli saw something too behind the silver mask of the champion. He saw pressure, he saw the weight of reputation, the burden of expectation, the fear of losing everything in front of everyone. They broke apart at the same moment, moving backward then forward again, their blades flashing across the space between them. The sound of metal and energy striking filled the arena like thunderclaps, but still no blood, still no scream, still no end. The crowd began to rise again, no longer laughing, no longer mocking, now drawn into the rhythm of the fight, into the truth of it. Two beings not just performing, but surviving each other, testing every second, every step, every breath. Zakar spun low and kicked up a burst of sand, a trick to blind his opponent, to break focus, to make the next strike hit deep. But Eli turned his face just in time and stepped through the sand cloud with his blade high, not attacking, but watching, waiting for the opening that would mean everything. The plasma blade came again, this time overhead, straight down with force enough to break stone, and Eli caught it with both hands, his steel sword crossed above his head, knees bent, boots steady, holding back the storm. The hum of the plasma now loud in his ears, the heat wrapping around his arms, but the steel held, the blade held, and Zakar's strike met resistance again. For a breath, neither moved. The crowd leaned forward, the arbiter raised one hand ready to signal, then they separated again, both breathing harder, both marked by dust and heat. but still standing, still whole, still fighting Zacchaeus. Armor was now stained at the edges by the sand, his breath no longer calm, his movements slightly wider, his feet digging deeper each time he struck. His style, now less dance, more hammer, more fire, more needle. Uniform was marked with scorched lines. The sleeves darkened, his hands red from heat, not injury, but close, so close. And yet his eyes had not changed, not once. His gaze never wavered, not from the sand, not from the heat, not from Zacchaeus. The sun reached the top of the sky now, and the heat pressed down like a hand on every shoulder, but neither warrior noticed, neither felt it. Their world was the ring, their time was the next second, their thought was only the next blade swing. Zacchaeus yelled and charged again, bringing his blade from the side with a roar, not of rage, but of defiance, of desperation, of everything he carried in his name, his title, his pride, his need to stay undefeated, to remain legend. I stepped aside only slightly and brought his sword down across the plasma arc, not with force, but with direction, guiding the energy off its path, turning it aside, and stepping into the gap that opened in the swing for just a moment, just enough. He did not strike, he only placed the tip of his blade near Zacchaeus' side, then stepped back before the crowd could even process it. Zacchaeus froze, his eyes wide, his hands still holding the blade raised, his body locked in the final position of the strike that never landed. He looked down and saw nothing, felt nothing, no blood, no pain, but he knew he had been open. He knew the human could have ended it there, could have won. The crowd saw it, too, gasped as one voice, not in pain, but in all. I returned to his position, blade lowered, eyes calm, face still unreadable. Zacchaeus looked at him not with anger, but with respect, with something new, something heavy. He adjusted his grip and said nothing. The fight was not over, but the moment had shifted. The crowd knew it, the arbiter knew it, even the stars seemed to pause in their movement. This was no longer a duel between old and new, between earth and Velker, between steel and plasma. This was something deeper, a test of memory versus pride, a fight between the past that refuses to die and the present that fears being forgotten. They stood again, still and ready, the blood sand untouched, the arbiter still watching, the crowd still holding its breath. And far above in the sky a lone cloud passed between the suns, and the arena fell into shadow, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the cold of something waiting, waiting for the next move, waiting for the blade that would finally break the silence, waiting for the first drop of blood. The sun above the arena dimmed as a rare cloud passed across both stars, casting the sand below into soft shadow, and the air felt heavy, like the sky itself was watching the duel and waiting for what came next. The crowd had stopped shouting, had stopped cheering now. They only watched, eyes wide, hands tight, minds silent, as the two warriors stood in the center of the ring, blades in hand, bodies worn, but not broken, hearts still beating strong. Zacchaeus, the champion, stood tall, but his shoulders no longer held the same pride. They now carried the weight of doubt, a weight he had never felt before, never needed to feel until now. He looked across the sand at the human, the one they had all mocked, the one they had all laughed at, the one who stood still with a sword of dead metal and yet refused to fall. Elivas stood calm, not still from fear, but still from control, each breath slow, each muscle waiting, each thought sharp as the blade in his hand, the steel sword that had already turned the tide, not through strength, not through speed, but through memory, through discipline, through a kind of war that Zacchaeus had never known. The plasma blade in Zacchaeus' hands flickered, its glow still bright, but now uncertain. His fingers felt the warmth of it, not as comfort, but as pressure, as if the weapon itself now questioned the path ahead. He turned slightly, shifted his footing, watched for a gap, for an opening, for anything that would let him end this before his legend cracked. He charged again, not wild, not desperate, but sharper, now cleaner, a warrior not trying to prove strength, but searching for truth. His blade moved in patterns, old and tested cuts that had ended 100 duels before, feints that had drawn blood from the greatest fighters in the galaxy, but each strike now met steel and silence, and a man who never blinked stepped with precision, his boots leaving clean lines in the sand, his blade meeting plasma, not with resistance, but with redirection, always just enough to slide the energy away, never wasting movement, never wasting strength. His eyes stayed on Zacchaeus' chest, reading the rhythm of breath, the turn of hip, the shift of shoulder before the attack even began. The sound of each clash echoed across the arena, steel and plasma, singing a song of past and future, of forgotten wars and rising pride. And the crowd felt every note, not in their ears, but in their bones. They saw what was happening, not just a fight, but a shift, not just a duel. But a lesson. Zakar swung from the right, his blade tracing a wide arc, and Eli ducked under it, stepping inside the circle of danger where most would never dare, and tapped the champion's armor with the flat of his blade, just a whisper of contact. Not enough to hurt, not enough to win, but enough to say, "I was here, and you missed." The arena gasped, not because blood had been drawn, but because it had not, because the human could have ended it, and chose not to, chose instead to show that he was still in control, still holding back, still teaching. Zakar stepped back, breathing heavy sweat on his brow, his body strong, but now tired, now worn, now aware that the fight was not going as he planned. His plasma blade still hummed, but it no longer sang, it no longer danced, it now cried for direction. Lie did not speak, did not smile, did not change. He waited again, sword low, not as a sign of weakness, but as an invitation, a signal to continue, a chance to try again. Above them, the arbiter watched, unmoving, his hand ready, but still not raised, his face carved from stone, but his eyes tracking every step, every swing, every moment that passed without blood. The rules were clear: first to bleed would lose, no tricks, no help, no escape. And yet the duel had lasted longer than any expected, longer than any in years, longer than any that had not already ended in death. Zakar growled low and moved again, but this time slower, this time smarter. He watched the human, now not as prey, but as rival. As equal, he tested the air with small strikes, short steps, fast moves, trying to feel the space, trying to see if the sword was as dangerous as it seemed, or if the man behind it was the real threat. I moved less, but each movement was clean, like a blade sliding through silk. His steps left no extra prints, his swings left no waste. His presence filled the ring like smoke, impossible to hold, impossible to cut. They met again in the center, blade to blade, sparks flew again, heat flashed again. But now the rhythm had changed. Now they danced not as strangers, but as mirrors, two warriors from different stars meeting in the same truth. Zakar twisted his blade downward, trying to catch the edge of steel and turn it into a cut, but Eli spun with him, their blades locking for a moment, grinding, not sliding, and both men pushed hard enough to bend knees, enough to leave lines in the sand, enough to make the arbiter tense. Then they broke apart again, neither falling, neither bleeding, but both marked now not just by heat and dust, but by something deeper, something earned. The crowd watched in awe, some standing now unable to sit, some with hands over mouths, some with tears in their eyes, not from sadness, but from something older, something like respect. Zakar looked at his opponent again and saw not a man, but a blade shaped like a man, a weapon made from time and pain and fire and silence, a soldier who had trained not to win applause, but to survive, to endure, to return. I looked at his opponent and saw not a monster, not a fool, not a child of pride, but a warrior who had finally begun to listen, who had finally begun to learn, who had finally stepped out from under the shadow of legend and into the light of truth. They circled each other now not as predator and prey, but as equals, their blades raised not to threaten, but to speak the language of fighters, the only language that mattered here. The sun returned from behind the cloud, and the light struck the sand once more, golden bright, burning across the ring like a forge. The shadow was gone, but the weight remained. The moment held. Zakar raised his blade and gave a nod, not low, not deep, but enough, and Eli returned it without a word, without a blink, and they stepped forward once more into the next exchange, into the next lesson. Steel and plasma met again, and this time the sound was softer, not weaker, but softer, like respect, like thunder at a distance, like the echo of something ancient returning home. The arbiter watched with eyes now wide, and the crowd leaned closer, and the stars above held still. And in that moment something shifted, not the blades, not the sand, not the rules, but the soul of the duel, the meaning of it, the truth of why they were here. Not to win, not to lose, but to remember what fighting meant, what weapons meant, what warriors truly were. They moved again, the shift complete. The duel was no longer about pride, it was now about honor. The crowd leaned in the sky, stood still. The sun poured golden light on the arena floor as two warriors stood across from one another, neither smiling, neither speaking, neither giving in. The only sound was the soft hum of Zakar's plasma blade and the whisper of wind around Eli's steel sword, both weapons alive in their own way, both carried by hands that had now earned the respect of all who watched from the towers, from the screens, from the stars beyond. Zakar's chest rose and fell, not from panic, but from pressure, not from fear, but from fire. His hands ached from the weight of his weapon, not because it was heavy, but because it had never been tested like this, never forced to keep striking, never forced to prove itself. Not in a show, not in a ceremony, but in a real fight where failure was not an idea, but a breath. Eli stood like a shadow made of stone, his eyes fixed on the silver warrior before him, his blade low, but not idle, his muscles ready, but not rushed. His feet planted deep in the sand where no step had faltered since the duel began. He waited, not as prey, not as predator, but as a question that had not yet been answered. The arbiter floated high above, unmoving, unblinking, his hand still raised, not to end the fight, but to honor the moment before history writes itself, the moment before something changes forever. Zachar narrowed his eyes, the weight of silence pushing against his mind. He remembered the cheers at the start, the laughter, the pride, the voice inside that told him no one could beat him. He remembered it, and now he buried it. Now he replaced it with the voice of the present, the voice of the blade, the voice of the sand. He moved not fast, not wild, but true. His blade swung with purpose. A high cut meant not to kill, but to draw, meant not to break, but to mark. Eli met the strike with a lift of steel, his blade catching the plasma edge and guiding it down and to the side, the heat brushing past his arm close enough to burn, but not to cut. Zachar turned with the motion, spinning low and sweeping his leg across the sand in a move that had ended duels before. Eli stepped back one step, then another, his balance never breaking, his sword never rising higher than needed, his body never opening more than allowed. They reset again, blades raised again, breath steady again, and the crowd felt the tension rise, not like fire, but like flood, slow, deep, unstoppable. Zachar lunged this time from the side, blade angled to slip beneath Eli's defense to catch the side of his ribs to make the first and final cut, but Eli twisted his hips and dropped low, his sword flashing upward in a tight arc that met the glowing blade with a crack of light and sent it up and over both men, moving now as mirrors again, both dancing again, both searching for the one perfect step that would end the rhythm. And then it happened. Zachar shifted his weight too fast, too far. His front foot slid in the sand just a little, just enough. His shoulder opened for less than a second, and Eli saw it not with his eyes, but with every part of his body. He stepped forward, the steel blade coming from the side, not fast, not hard, but sharp with intent. The edge touched Zachar's arm just above the elbow, slicing across the armor where the plates thinned for movement. The steel passed through with a whisper and left behind a thin red line that bloomed like a flower across silver skin. Zachar froze, his blade still raised, his breath caught in his chest. He looked down slowly at his arm and saw the red line growing, saw the blood forming, saw the rules fulfilled. The arbiter lowered his hand, and the crowd gasped, not as one voice, but as a storm of noise, a wave of sound that rose into the sky and shook the walls, not with anger, not with shock, but with awe, with wonder, with the sound of 1,000 beings realizing that something impossible had just happened. I stepped back one step, then another, lowering his blade slowly, not in mockery, not in pride, but in silence, in respect, in honor of the moment, in honor of the warrior who had stood with him through this fire. Zachar stared at the blood on his arm, his breath now steady again, his face no longer twisted in pride, no longer carved in rage. He looked up at Eli and saw not an enemy, not a stranger, but a warrior, a teacher, a mirror. He dropped to one knee, the plasma blade deactivating and falling beside him into the sand, the light fading from its edge, the glow disappearing into memory. The arbiter spoke, his voice ringing across the arena. Blood has been drawn, the duel is done, the winner stands the first to bleed. Neil's honor is complete. The crowd erupted, not in cheers of victory, but in something deeper, clapping, pounding, chanting not a name, but a truth, not a sound of one world rising, but of all listening. Lie stood still, his blade now sheathed across his back, his hand resting at his side, his eyes not on the crowd, not on the arbiter, not even on Zachar, but on the sky above, on the stars beyond, on the silence after a storm. Zachar stood slowly, wiping the blood from his arm and looking at it with calm eyes. He walked across the sand and stood before Eli. No words, no gestures, just a nod, a slow, deep nod that carried with it everything: pride, respect, pain, and understanding. Lie returned the nod, and the two warriors turned away, walking toward opposite gates, both stepping across the same sand now marked not by war, but by truth. Above the arena, the sun returned from behind the cloud, and the light poured down again, golden bright, warm, and clear, shining across the red line in the sand that marked the place where steel had touched flesh and story had become legend. Far away in the control tower, the duel masters sat in silence. One turned off the screens, one whispered something about history, another simply stared at the still image of the final cut, repeating the moment in their mind like a song that would never fade. In the scholar towers, the Scribes began writing fast, their hands moving without rest as they recorded the duel, the rules, the shift, the strike, the bleed, not as data, not as numbers, but as a tale, a warning, a lesson to be passed on to every warrior, every student, every child who asked if steel could stand against light. And somewhere deep beneath the arena, in a small chamber where the light did not reach, the old historian Valsur watched the replay one more time, his many eyes blinking slowly as he whispered they forgot what steel meant, but now they remember. The sun began to set over the Valkorian arena, casting long shadows across the blood sand as the last heat of the day faded and a cool silence settled over the towering stone walls. The crowd had already begun to leave, their voices soft now, their faces still marked with the weight of what they had seen. No one shouted, no one laughed. They spoke in hushed tones about a man who brought steel to a world of light, about a fight that turned into a memory, about the moment when the proud bled and the quiet stood tall. Eli Voss walked alone through the quiet hall behind the arena, his sword wrapped again in dark cloth slung across his back, his boots echoing against the cold floor. Each step steady, each breath calm. The door to the outer corridors opened without sound, and he stepped into the long tunnel that led back to the human quarters. No fanfare, no celebration, no welcome party waited for him. There was only silence and the long walk through memory. Zachar sat alone in the empty chamber, once filled with light and pride, now dim, now quiet, now filled with something new. His arm wrapped in a silver cloth, his blade laid across the bench before him, its glow no longer shining, its hum now silent. He stared not at the wound, but at his reflection in the polished wall, where he saw not defeat, but change, not weakness, but learning. For the first time in years, he remembered a fight from long ago, not in the arena, but in the wild hills of his home world, where he lost a duel to his older brother, who struck faster and cleaner and left him with a scar across the cheek. He remembered how that loss shaped him more than any victory, how it pushed him to train harder, move sharper, breathe deeper. And now, as he stared at the red mark on his arm, he felt that same fire rise again, not to win back what was lost, but to grow beyond what he was. Above the arena, the arbiter stood alone on the floating platform, his hands behind his back, his gaze sweeping the sand below. He remembered every duel he had ever watched, every moment of blood, every roar of the crowd, but none stayed with him like this. None burned into his memory like the silent clash between plasma and steel, between tradition and forgotten strength, between pride and patience. He looked toward the empty gate where the human had entered and whispered words too soft for any to hear, a name that would now be written in the records, a story that would now be told to every student of the duel, not as warning, not as fear, but as truth. In the Scholar Tower, ancient scribes filled page after page with ink and memory. One wrote the details of each strike, another recorded the faces of the crowd, another traced the pattern of Eli's sword through the air with care and wonder. They spoke little as they worked, but their minds burned with the realization that they had witnessed the return of something old, something real, something that had not been seen since the first wars of the stars. At the edge of the city, near the barracks where human diplomats and soldiers were stationed, a group of young warriors gathered around a screen, watching the replay of the duel in silence. One pointed at the moment when Eli stepped into the final swing, another paused it on the frame where steel kissed armor and the red line bloomed on Zachar's arm. None of them laughed, none of them mocked. They only watched and learned. One of the younger warriors leaned forward and asked in a soft voice, "How can something without glow break the king's defense?" An older one replied, "Without turning, steel remembers what light forgets." In a small chamber below the arena, deep in the archive vault, a vault keeper unlocked an old display case covered in dust and darkness. Inside it lay weapons of the past, swords made of metal, spears carved from bone, shields painted by hand. He placed a new item among them, a copy of Eli's blade forged from the same steel using Earth's ancient method. Beside it, he placed a scroll with the duel's full record and sealed the case again, this time with light. Back in the human quarters, Eli sat alone in a small room with bare walls and a wooden table, his hands resting on the cloth-wrapped sword, his face unreadable. A gentle knock came at the door, and he opened it to find a small Valkorian child standing there holding a drawing made in chalk and ash. The drawing showed two figures, one holding a glowing blade, the other holding a long black sword with no light, both standing in the center of the arena. The child said nothing, just held it up with wide eyes. Eli took the drawing and looked at it, then nodded. and placed it gently on the table. The child turned and ran down the hall without a word, and Eli looked back at the sword, his hand resting on the cloth like it was not a weapon, but a piece of home. The stars rose above Velker, now bright and still, and the arena lights dimmed for the night. But even in darkness, the sand held the mark of the duel, a faint line where blood had touched earth, where memory had touched pride, where two warriors had stood not as enemies, but as truths facing one another in silence. And in Firesicker stood once more in the chamber doorway, watching the stars without speaking, without moving, his mind full of questions, not of how to defeat the human, but of how to learn from him, how to carry the lesson forward, how to make sure that what happened today was not lost to time, but carried into every future fight. He looked down at his arm, where the red line was already fading, where the skin would soon seal, but the mark would remain, and he smiled, not with joy, but with understanding. Lai walked out into the open courtyard behind the quarters, the sword still across his back. The stars above so clear he could see the edge of the nearby moon. He sat on the stone bench and let the silence wash over him, the silence that follows storms, the silence that follows truth. Somewhere in the control tower, the duel masters opened the official archive and added a name to the Hall of Record, not just as challenger, not just as victor, but as something older, something sacred. They added the title Keeper of Steel, and beside it they placed the name of the man who made the galaxy remember what it tried to forget. Livos, no music played, no fireworks, no celebration, just stars, just wind, just silence, and the long memory of steel. The duel was over, but the story had just begun.